Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Gresham College. The more observant amongst you will realize that I am not Ken Costa. Ken, very unfortunately, has been delayed in Berlin due to the Pope's visit, and he's been unable to make a flight back to give this evening's lecture. But that said, he worked very, very hard on it, and I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm the former Professor of Commerce, and I've been asked if I wouldn't mind reading the lecture and then helping us through a bit of a discussion afterwards in the time that's available. So without any further ado, I'll begin reading from Ken's text, and then we can pick up from there. The title of this evening's talk is Vision and Values in a Time of Volatility. And no one could accuse 2011 of being a slow news year. So far, and we're only 3/4 through the year, we have had protests and regime change in Tunisia, protests and regime change in Egypt, protests, civil war, and what looks like regime change in Libya, protest, civil war, and what is not yet regime change in Syria, not to mention political demonstrations in Jordan, Yemen, Morocco, and Palestine. We've had the ongoing massive Eurozone debt crises with a bailout in Ireland, which technically was the end of 2010, but was still very much a live political issue this year. A bailout in Portugal, a second bailout in Greece, which appears to have been as inadequate as the first, and perhaps even a third looming. Rumors of bailouts in Spain and Italy, massive and massively unpopular austerity measures being adopted in a number of European countries, not least of which Britain. And the prospect of, to coin a phrase, the slow-motion economic collapse of the euro, or possibly a rapid lurch towards fiscal union as the only way of saving the euro. So what started off as a crisis of liquidity in banks across the world has turned into a no less severe crisis of national solvency. And ironically, perhaps that isn't strong enough a word, the exposure of various European banks to Greece's seemingly unpayable sovereign debt, as evidenced by the recent downgrading of the credit rating of French banks, Crédit Agricole, Société Générale, etc., the crisis of national solvency looks like it might ricochet back into a liquidity crisis again. Beyond the Eurozone, the U.S. economy remains in a parlous state. Standard & Poor's took the unprecedented step of downgrading the U.S.'s rating in August. It was a controversial move at the time, but when unemployment figures later showed that the U.S. economy had in effect created no jobs that month, the rating seemed less contentious. And as if a stagnant economy and jobs market were not enough, the painful wrangling between Democrats and Republicans about a budget deal over the summer raised the unthinkable specter of U.S. economy defaulting on its $14 trillion debt and created further instability in global markets. Indeed, so frustrated were other large economies over this game of economic chicken that China's state-run media even called U.S. politicians dangerously irresponsible for the wrangling. Now, China itself, of course, has not suffered from the debt contagion plaguing the West and shows signs of continuing, even growing domestic demand, but it is far from immune from what is a global debt crisis. It is widely criticized for keeping its currency artificially low and for frustrating not only political wrangling in Washington, but also its exposure to a fall in Western consumer demand. So overall, just as the Eurozone crisis mutated from being one of financial liquidity to national sovereignty, so the global debt crisis has shifted this year from being one of financial indebtedness to one of political authority. Events in Greece, Europe, the US, and elsewhere would not have been solved by some firm political resolve, but they would undoubtedly have been or be helped by it. And then, turning closer to home, we have had the slow and painful unfolding of a media phone hacking scandal that not only beggars moral belief, hacking into the phones of murdered children and grieving relatives, but has also heralded the extraordinary spectacle of two of the most powerful media men in the world appearing before a parliamentary select committee, one of whom is set to return to the stage. We've also had the much more rapid, but no less painful explosion of rioting in numerous UK cities, motivated by little more than violence and greed. And you might want to add to this potent mix rape charges made and then dropped against the head of the IMF, Massive tsunami and fears of a nuclear meltdown in Japan, massive famine in the Horn of Africa, a massacre in Norway, the killing of the world's most wanted terrorists. Oh yes, and of course, a royal wedding. Whew. Newspapers have clearly been kept busy this year, when they weren't listening to other people's voice messages, that is. 2011 has been quite extraordinarily volatile. And if there's one thing business and the markets hate, it is volatility. Uncertainty, rapid change, unpredictability, these are deeply problematic trends and conditions in which to try and conduct business. And that is one of the reasons why, in my news review of 2011, I left out one of the most important stories, largely because it is a story told on the back of all the other stories. Uncertainty caused by global volatility, just mentioned, has meant that global stock markets have been on a greater than usual roller coaster. The general direction has been downwards. Global share prices remain almost a third lower than their peak prior to the crisis. And as a mark of the overall sense of uncertainty, last month, gold hit a record high of $1,900, although subsequently bouncing around even more. And although 2011 has not been as bad in the markets as 2008, which witnessed in the UK 5 of the 10 worst days the FTSE 100 has ever had, or 1987 for that matter, which saw 4 of the other 5 nightmare days, it has certainly still been a grim year. Now, every age can lay a claim to uncertainty. There are always events, dear boy, events, as Prime Minister Harold Macmillan once said. I suspect Ken would have read that better. He's got the better accent. However, the last 3 years seem to have been something different. Of course, the last 20 years have seen some hugely traumatic moments, most of which had something to do with the threat of or supposed reaction to Al-Qaeda and extreme Islamist violence. However, in a paradoxical way, that threat served only to cement our conviction in the rightness of our system. It was precisely our economic and political system and its freedoms that so enraged these extremists. So it was precisely those systems and its freedoms that we would preserve. What has happened over the last 3 years has been more fundamental in its implications. The age of irrational exuberance, or turbocharged capitalism, that has dominated the West, indeed the world, since the fall of communism, appears to have turned in on itself with such ferocity that many people feel that there is something profoundly different about our particular circumstances. It is almost as if we are in some in-between stage where the other certainties and expectations are dying and we don't know what to expect of the new ones. To be quite clear, I am not predicting the end of capitalism here or the reversal of globalization. Rather, I am saying that our time has some justification for claiming to be a time of particular volatility, and that volatility may be well more than a temporary, if slightly severe, glitch before we pass back to the status quo. Rather, that volatility may be caused by a more profound and long-lasting change of direction, perhaps even a change which recognizes that our generation-long experiment, in which we have assumed that we can do politics and do business without recourse to fundamentally moral commitments, perhaps that experiment is coming to an end. If it is, we can expect a time of ongoing volatility, and even if it isn't, there are no signs of our volatile times calming down substantially. If there is one thing that makes doing business particularly difficult, it is, as I said earlier, volatility. So I want to ask the question, what, if anything, can guide us through this time? How can we hope to negotiate such volatility? And my argument is that any response, and particularly any response in business, demands 2 key elements: vision and values. I want to unpack both of these in a little detail before bringing them together in the end. I'll start with vision. What is vision and why does it matter? Vision, like hope and community, is one of those words that has much political currency. You can't move for politicians, particularly around election time, talking about their vision for the nation. It's a word and idea with a history as long as humanity itself. There's a biblical saying that even those unfamiliar with the Bible often remember. In its most famous translation, that of the King James Bible, whose 400th anniversary we're celebrating this year, and which Gresham had an event at Mercer's Hall on Monday, according to that translation, it runs as follows: "Where there is no vision, the people perish. Where there is no vision, the people perish." It can also, however, be translated, "Where there is no vision, people cast off restraint." Either way, this little proverb could be well adopted for the events of 2011. In Egypt, Iraq, and Libya, brutal and authoritarian leaders had no vision for their countries, or rather, no vision that anyone beyond a small coterie of loyal followers supported. And accordingly, their people perished. Thankfully, the people managed to throw off their leaders, but much more, of course, needs to be done. And if it is to be done successfully, the people themselves will need to develop and spread a just and generous vision for their country. Precisely the kind of vision they had been starved of up until now. In a rather different way, the phrase could certainly be adopted to describe those people who erupted into mindless, selfish violence in a dozen or so English cities in early August, smashing, stealing, and scorching to their heart's content. These people had no vision of a properly organized social existence, no vision of what is right and wrong, and accordingly, they were only too willing to cast off restraint when they had the opportunity. It is interesting here that policing was at best only a temporary substitution for true morality. One or two rioters gave interviews to TV reporters in the immediate aftermath of the violence, rather unadvisedly, one would have thought. And they said that they were doing what they were doing because the authorities, particularly the police, were not around, or unable to control them, or simply needed to be shown a lesson. So the idea that where there is no vision, people cast off restraint could be adopted to describe the age of irrational exuberance, or casino capitalism, or financial irresponsibility, or personal indebtedness, or me consumerism. You can choose your preferred term. In actual fact, as you may have spotted in these examples, what was lacking was not so much just a vision as a properly grounded vision. The truth is not so much that where there is no vision, people cast off restraint, but rather, without a vision that is grounded in values, the people throw off restraint. I will return to values in a moment, but first I want to unpack the idea of vision in just a little more detail. The whole idea of vision has two separate components to it. The first is the more prosaic part. Put simply, if you don't know where you are going, you are highly unlikely to get there. I often say myself, if you don't know where you're going, you are highly likely to get there. And this is a maxim that holds well in every sphere of life. I doubt whether there is a husband and wife who have never quarreled in the car because one or other, I won't say who, has forgotten the directions or the map, or doesn't have a good idea of where they're supposed to be heading. On a more serious level, running a business is made all the more difficult if you have no strategy, no idea of where you want to be in 3 or 4 or 5 years hence, and no idea of getting there. No vision. Governments beg the electorate's favor on the basis of their vision, otherwise known as their manifesto, for the country. It's not simply a question of how inspiring that vision is, a factor to which I shall presently turn, but also how credible it is. The message, this is where we are, this is what has gone wrong, this is where we want to go, and this is how we plan to get there, has to be believable. In one respect, therefore, vision is simply having some idea of direction and destination. But there is a second component to the idea of vision, and this is a less prosaic and more inspirational sense. This is the sense that politicians like to use when they are making their set-piece speeches. This is vision as in a guiding and inspiring sight. Vision in the almost mystical sense of the word. It is the idea not simply of your direction and destination, but of things as they could be, of transformation, of genuine and inspiring difference. This is when you have a vision of what a country could really be like when it is otherwise racked by poverty, insecurity, and dictatorship. the kind of vision that has inspired many rebels in the Arab world this momentous year. It is the vision of what a company can be like if all the staff not only understand, but really get, are really motivated, are really inspired by where the CEO says they're going, and accordingly work together to achieve it. A vision of superb service provision or superior products that not only are the envy of competitors, but also make an obvious and positive contribution to wider society. It is the vision of what your local neighborhood could be like if it were not plagued by gangs and graffiti and rubbish and CCTV cameras, but rather by children, families, parks, trust. You will notice that in each of these examples, vision is not a static thing. Indeed, almost by definition, vision is about change, certainly about the capability of dealing with change. That is why it is so important in a time like ours, a time of volatility, that vision provides the constancy and the inspiration for being able to deal with ups and downs in unpredictable times. Vision in both these senses is necessary. We need to know where we are going and how we are going to get there, although I've said that many people call that strategy rather than vision. And we need to know that we want to get there, to be sufficiently inspired and attracted by the idea of where we are heading, to sustain with patience and perseverance that are necessary to any serious venture. It is without such a vision that the people, a society, a community, a business, a charity will perish. Vision is necessary, but as I've already indicated, not sufficient. Put bluntly, it is no good that the man or the woman at the top has the most inspiring or credible vision, because what matters is whether he or she wants to take their company and where they want to take it if that vision is not communicated or shared or believed by everyone else. A classic business study, nearly 20 years old, underlines the significance of vision, and crucially long-term vision. James Collins and Jerry Paras had a 1994 publication, Built to Last: Successful Habits of Visionary Companies. They looked at those companies that had lasted, visionary companies, and compared them with other companies in similar industries, which, while strong, had performed neither as well nor as consistently. From 1926 through to 1990, the comparison companies outperformed the general stock market by 2 times, whereas the visionary companies outperformed the market by 15 times. The visionary companies turned out to be distinguished by an enduring set of core values or ideology, which preserved intact over many years and through many changes of leadership. Accordingly, although I will return to vision later on, I now want to turn to my second key element that is necessary if we wish to negotiate today's volatility: values. The post-match commentary after the terrible riots that rocked English towns last month was as interesting and perhaps as surprising as the riots themselves. The barefaced, selfish, greedy violence of the riots, people walking away with plasma TV screens, people trying on trainers before they looted, people torching shops and cars for no reason whatsoever. Because of this, it was difficult, even for the usual suspects, to blame the traditional culprits: government policy, cuts, poverty, inequality. There was an element of poverty in some of the behavior of the rioters, and sure, a society that is simultaneously as materialistic and as materially unequal as ours is one that is liable to breed discontent. But the bottom line, which we saw, all of us, on our televisions, was that this was fundamentally a moral issue. This was an issue about what people in their everyday lives thought was right and wrong, acceptable and unacceptable, what, in short, their values were. For the first time in ages, it became possible for politicians to do morality in public, in front of the cameras, and not to be accused of being judgmental or draconian. Which doesn't mean, of course, that they weren't accused of being hypocritical or judgmental or draconian. Values were back on the agenda, and with a vengeance. For some people, of course, they had never been off the agenda. Some people had, and always do, find it easy to talk about value. But in public, In a morally plural society such as our own, it is simply easier for people not to do values and to concentrate instead on narrow technical or economic or administrative or efficiency issues. Doing values was seen to be too risky. Not anymore, it seems. Economic and political solutions are not enough to heal what ails us. We need values. And there are 4 points I would like to make about values and why they speak to, indeed why they are necessary in our current situation. The first point is that they are not, or they should not be, susceptible to volatility in the same way as so much else. Values are constants. They do not flip-flop according to circumstance or events. Indeed, quite to the contrary, values are there precisely to enable people to navigate through circumstances or events, no matter how volatile they are. If you hold something to be valuable, honesty or integrity, for example, if they are your values, they do not stop being your values just because circumstances become tough. Honesty is not a value if it is exercised only when it is easy or cost-free to do so. People who are honest only when it suits do not have honesty as a value. Of course, we all know that life is more complex than this, and there are times when all of us struggle to maintain our values in difficult circumstances. But that is precisely what we would expect of values. If they are really values, they are liable to challenge and shape the way we live our lives. They are enduring. Values, by definition, are not volatile. Rather, they help us stabilize the volatile circumstances in which we live, smoothing out the amplitude of precarious and unforeseen circumstances. The second point, linked to the first, values go deep. The very reason for the way in which they are able to resist every circumstantial wind that blows, to stand up against the volatility of the times, is that they go right to the heart of what it is about being human, being alive, that we consider to be worthwhile. Like a sturdy tree that withstands the winds and the seasons, values have roots, deep invisible roots, right into the human soul, if I can put it that way. They nourish, sustain, and protect us. Jacob Bronowski, the great scientist, historian, and presenter of that famous 1973 BBC documentary series, The Ascent of Man, once said, "The values by which we are to survive are not rules for just and unjust conduct, but are those deeper illuminations in whose light justice and injustice, good and evil, means and ends are seen in fearful sharpness of outline." And from a closer and slightly more contemporary field, a massive NHS study into the value of values recently stated that only values that are deeply embedded in an organization's culture and which are central to employees' self-definition and identity are what will make a difference to the way in which an employee behaves. Values need to go deep, else they are simply fads. The third point, and more contentiously, values involve serving the common or wider good. They are not simply about me. Greed is not a value. Selfishness is not a value. Looking after my own interests, particularly at the expense of others, is not a value. By contrast, when you think of the values that we appreciate or admire, generosity, patience, kindness, faithfulness, honesty, integrity, we can see that these are all oriented around the wider good, helping and serving other people, the community, society as a whole. And the fourth point, values must be widely and genuinely held. This is critically important, and it must be said somewhat against the grain of the times, which is one of policy, regulation, legislation. If the culture of a business, an organization, or an entire society is to be changed, the people that belong to it need to buy into the values. Culture cannot be changed by fiat or edict. It can only be changed by changed personal commitments, and this is hard work. There's an old saying among consultants to the effect that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It is very true. Unless people actually share those values, genuinely believe in and practice them, no amount of strategizing will make a difference. Worse than that, as the saying implies, if you try to change culture through edict or simply apply strategy without taking any account of the culture into which it is to be implemented, you are in grave danger of throwing good money after bad. So just as values need to be constant, deep-rooted, and grounded in a genuine concern for the wider good, they also need to be shared. So this is what we can say about values. They are strong and secure against volatility. They go all the way down, being deeply rooted in our ideas about life. They are oriented around the good, defined and justified by a wider vision of serving others. And they are, and need to be, held personally and shared among the relevant people. There's an important caveat to get in here, and this is that the importance of values does not demand a one-size-fits-all approach. A successful values-driven company does not have to boast a particular, specific, limited range of values. Research shows that there is no single set of values shared by all visionary companies. Rather, the crucial variable is not the content of the company's ideology, but how deeply it believes its ideology and how constantly it lives, breathes, and expresses it in all it does. In one international study, although only 89% of companies had written value statements, it was those that had worked hard to embed those values in behavior that realized the value of their values. The real strength of these leading companies lies in the way they link their values to corporate operations and the behavior of their staff. Now, this all sounds fine in theory, but is it important? Well, I think it's important to underline the point that it is more than just theory. Research consistently shows that when it comes to organizational performance, a serious commitment to serious values works. In 1999, 2 consultants carrying out a year-long project to produce a business strategy for HM Customs and Excise asked a question: do organizational values actually matter to staff? And the results of the survey were telling. The more that staff felt that the organization's values fitted their own, the higher their level of job satisfaction. Conversely, those with a low sense of fit were less satisfied. People wanted to feel that the organization they work for is in tune with their values. And this was not a one-off result. A growing body of research demonstrates that when we believe our own personal values match those of the organization in which we work, then we feel more satisfied with our jobs and workplaces, identify more strongly with the organization, feel more personally successful, and more supported in that success, and we think less about leaving. And predictably, the converse is also true. Having strong values also helps mitigate the dangers of risk. In an international survey covering 365 companies, 90% of senior executives argued that a strong corporate statement of values was critical in encouraging individual employees to take action and inform their managers when something seemed wrong. It was this kind of environment that prevented errors from turning into disasters. Values and ethics. Now, we've already recognized there's no single set of values shared by all visionary companies. Not surprisingly, therefore, the precise definition of those values will vary. However, it is worth noting how many of them are simply moral in the sense of the word we all commonly understand. You may be familiar with an old cartoon in which 2 well-heeled businessmen are sitting enjoying a drink. They are intense in conversation. One leans over to the other and says, "Get serious, John. We're talking business ethics, not ethics." Well, witty as this is, there's good reason to believe it is wit rather than reality. Values, in the sense that I have been using the word, doesn't mean ethics, but there is good evidence to suggest that there can and even should be significant overlap. One of the studies cited earlier compared financial leaders, that's organizations that outperform their industry averages, with other public organizations. And they found that the financial leaders are much more likely than other public organizations to include in their values statements, for example, 1, integrity and ethical behavior. 98% of financial leaders versus 88% of other companies. Commitment to employees. 88% of financial leaders, 68% of other companies. Honesty and openness. 85% of financial leaders, 47% of other companies. A drive to succeed, 68% of financial leaders, 29% of other companies. And adaptability, 42% of financial leaders, 9% of other companies. Now, while drive to succeed and adaptability might be the kind of value you would only expect to see so named in the business world, integrity, ethical behavior, commitment, honesty, and openness are values of universal appeal. And this is important to recognize, as values in business could, in theory, be limited to the drive to succeed category. And this would run counter to my argument that values should involve serving the common or wider good, that they are ethical at root, and that they are not simply about me and my interests. If it were the case that the successful values-driven organizations were the ones who boasted values such as hard work, drive, determination, then my argument would be weaker. It is not, of course, that there is anything intrinsically wrong with any of these values. Indeed, I would argue that they are very important to a successful business. However, it is my contention that values matter and make a difference, and that the ones that make the biggest difference are those that also fall into the ethics category. So we have a combination of business ethics and values that matter over time. This is not simply wishful thinking, as there is mounting evidence for it. The Ethisphere Institute, an international think tank that deals with the best practice in business ethics and corporate social responsibility, researches the success, or otherwise, of those businesses that take ethics seriously. I understand that this can be difficult to define, ethics that is, and difficult indeed to define precisely, but the Institute is open about its methodology for all to examine, and it is available on the website. Their list of the world's most ethical companies go beyond making statements about doing business ethically and put their values into action. The Institute has found that investing in ethics is beneficial for a company, even in a recession. In their comparison of world's most ethical companies and the Standard & Poor's 500 since 2007, they found that the ethical companies significantly outperformed the normal ones. Those organizations that put their values into practice, even during this difficult time of volatility, did well out of it. Values help us navigate volatility, but ethical values help us navigate even better. So let's look at combining vision and values. My argument then is that by combining these two things, vision and values, we can navigate our way through the volatility of these times. It is by having a vision for change, a vision which is both realistic and inspiring, which is rooted in values, values that are constant, deeply rooted, ethically grounded, and widely shared, that we can hope to negotiate volatility. But what does this mean in practice? In particular, what does this mean in practice for business and commerce? And let me give you two examples by way of illustration before we conclude. The first is of Ray Anderson, sustainable business pioneer, who recently died, age 77. Anderson was founder and chairman of Interface, the world's largest manufacturer of modular carpet. He pioneered the goal of achieving zero negative environmental impact through a change in his business paradigm. He was a truly visionary leader in this field, making sure his company stayed focused on zero footprint goals in such areas as waste, energy use, and emissions. In his book, Confessions of a Radical Industrialist, he described how his change in thinking came about when he was being asked to provide his company with an environmental vision. The best that he could come up with at the time was that they should comply with all the many rules and regulations that government agencies seem to love to send our way, which was somewhat unsatisfying. It was only when he read another book, Paul Hawken's The Ecology of Commerce, that the penny dropped for him. Interestingly, he describes it in visionary, almost religious language. It was an epiphany, a rude awakening, an eye-opening experience. And the point of the story felt just like the point of a spear driven straight into my heart. It was values just as much as vision, however, that made the difference for him. Environmental issues were a matter of morality to him, not simply business sense, because he believed that any company that takes more from the planet than it gives back is involved in plunder. As he told a conference in 2009, "Theft is a crime, and the theft of our children's future will someday be considered a crime." This is ethical value, pure and simple. Understanding that business is a moral enterprise, understanding that only ethical values, not box ticking and regulation, can ever really deliver the goods, and having the ability to communicate this vision of values to others. It was this combination of values and vision that enabled Anderson to turn Interface into a market leader. And let's take a second example from a very different field. Tradecraft, and I'll just spell that for those of you. Trade, T-R-A-I-D, craft, C-R-A-F-T. Tradecraft is a Christian-based organization committed to using trade and business to fight against poverty. It has been in operation since 1979 and has grown since then to the extent that you are likely to find at least some of its products in most supermarkets across the country, although it persists in having problems in selling into some of the low-end chains. Tradecraft is motivated by a vision and has been since its earliest days. It is, to put it gently, a big vision. Our vision is a world freed from the scandal of poverty, where trade is just and people and communities can flourish. That vision could easily sound pie in the sky, but Tradecraft shows that it need not be. And the reason for this is that its vision is grounded in values. Tradecraft is upfront about how it expresses its Christian principles in its policies and activities, especially the principles of love, justice, and service. It promotes responsible stewardship of the created environment, the fair and equal treatment of women and men, and relationships between the rich and the poor, which are marked by mutuality and respect. The organization seeks fairness for the producers, customers, shareholders, and employees with whom it works, and is open and honest in its reporting back to stakeholders. Now, despite all that, Tradecraft appears wary of using the word values, which doesn't appear so often in its literature. It is clearly a value-rich organization: fairness, equality, mutuality, respect, openness, honesty, service, justice, and love. These are all undeniably values, and one that most people admire. That said, and to repeat what I said above, not all organizations that value values should value those particular ones. Indeed, some will feel that some of them, such as service and love, are either too explicitly religious or otherwise inappropriate for business. That's fine. The point about values is that not every organization or business has to share the same ones, any more than every organization or business has to share the same vision. If you are guided by a vision, that vision needs to be grounded in values that are constant, deeply rooted, and widely held. This isn't, it should be stressed, a question of religion. Tradecraft might be religious, but Anderson was not. Rather, it is a question of having a vision of what can be, a vision that can enable you to negotiate times of change and volatility, and grounded in genuine and seriously held values. Well, there is, of course, no guarantee that things will work out. The world is a big and complex and, as we have seen, hugely volatile place, and it may not matter how visionary or values-driven an organization is. If political regimes are volatile, given literally to explode, or if the macroeconomic context in which a business operates is effectively held hostage to enormous sovereign debt and inability to restructure certain economies, or if the wider social context of society is deeply unstable, with thousands of people seemingly willingly going on the rampage and stealing with impunity at the drop of not so much as a hat, let alone if nature shows her violent, unpredictable side, as people on the east coast of Japan have been so long sadly aware. If any of these things kick off, let alone all of them kick off together as they have in 2011, there is not much business can do about it. But a serious commitment to vision and ethical values is the best means we do have to guard against and navigate a time of volatility. Thank you. again, our apologies that Ken has been so sadly stuck in Germany, although given that my wife's German, I should say happily stuck in Germany. But I thought I certainly can't answer questions, but I do share many of Ken's ideas, and I just thought perhaps take a few minutes to have a few moments of discussion or commentary from folks. James, as ever, has the microphone, and gentlemen, perhaps you can lead off, and then we'll move to this gentleman here.
I'm Andrew Rixham. I'm a public health doctor. You mentioned the values and the vision of being very long-term, but companies are assessed on a very short-term basis, profit. Combined with that, some of the negative things you were saying about not having values were about personal issues around the rioting, rather than examples from companies. And one of the largest pharmaceutical companies last year was fined $6 billion for after a whistleblower revealed that they had falsified research results. And as a result of that, by their own figures, probably worldwide, 250,000 people died. That's a quarter of Rwanda, half a Darfur. How do you stop that sort of cancer, as it were, of values occurring when they have to be long-term, and yet they are responding to short-term profit?
That's a good bit. I've got a few comments on that, but perhaps we'll take a couple more comments from the floor, and then I'll maybe respond, and we can see how the tenor of the audience is. Sir?
Hi, my name's John Algar. My day job, I'm an investment banker. In your analysis of vision, you argue that widespread credibility is a key pillar for any successful vision. And I think in government, the derived public confidence from that credibility is really one of the foundations of our democracy. Now, I worry that in the UK, there's evidence of a widespread lack of confidence in our public institutions and leadership. And some specific examples, you look at poll ratings for both coalition and opposition governments in their ability to navigate us through the current economic crisis, and they're dangerously low. You look on the other side of the Atlantic, and ratings for both the Democrats and the Republicans, again, are at a near-time historic low. So given the implications of the lack of vision that you outlined, I'd be interested in hearing your comments on what is, to me, seems like a widespread lack of public vision in public institutions and could mean. Thank you.
Okay. And another comment, lady over here.
Okay, sorry. My name's Deborah Pouch. I wanted to ask about, you spoke about vision and values, but what about accountability? And I think you spoke about the riots and the upheavals in the Arab world, and that was driven by a lack of accountability. And what a lot of the general public feel, that there has been no accountability either in Wall Street or in the City of London for the situation that the banking crisis has been turned into a sovereign debt crisis. I'd like you to comment on that, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting continuity there. Well, the first thing is just to remind you folks that there was a great thing in the late 70s and early 80s. They had a cartoon character called Max Headroom, and he was obviously just a cartoon character that was being pumped. So I am not Ken Costa, so anything I say is not necessarily Ken. I'm just the talking head tonight. But these have been subjects of some of my lectures, and you've sparked a few very interesting thoughts, I think. Firstly, Gresham College helped to found something called long finance, which is looking at some of these drivers between, why is it short-term and long-term. And I think that touches actually at the roots of accountability and confidence, for that matter. In the course of doing a lot of the long finance work, we return repeatedly to two things, communities and trust, repeatedly. And I think that comes back to some of the issues that we face here, because accountability is to my community. I would argue. And there's an interesting academic by the name of David Graeber, who's a somewhat heretical left-wing anarchist, and I'm hoping to have him over next year on the 1st of March for one of our Gresham events, with luck, fingers crossed. David Graeber has written the most fascinating book, I really do recommend. It's called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Modest title, yeah. Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Just knock that one off. And this is my definition, and I think this is what I took from it, and I'm pretty sure somewhere buried in the 600 pages, he said something pretty darn close. A community forms when people are prepared to be indebted to one another. Now, at first, that sounds a bit like kind of I'm turning everything into commerce. In fact, his book is very anti-transactional-based commerce. It's when I'm prepared to be indebted to one another. That can be about love, affection, caring, and it can be monetary. And that's what he talks about. And trust, of course, becomes an interesting issue as well, the origins of money. The origins of money, anthropologists are finally challenging economists. You'll have seen, obviously, a lot of the crisis is purportedly due to the narrow view that economists take of the world, of equations, of mathematics, of Homo economicus, and there's some truth in that. But the first challenge to that has been the behavioral scientists who've come back and said, well, actually, this isn't the way people work in practice. And that's been a running theme for the last 30 years in economics, is to try and make sure we reflect how people really make decisions. But the second thing that's been coming really more recently in the last 10 years have been challenges to economics from anthropologists. And the anthropologists have been saying, so let me understand, Adam Smith talks about a barter economy, people making pins and all that. There's just one problem we have. We've studied thousands of cultures around the world, and we can't find a single barter economy. There's no barter economy in the world. Economies start with things like social monies or religious monies. I had the most fascinating session just a few weeks ago with another academic, Giovanni Cascu, a Sardinian who spent 3 years living with the Yolngu Indians in Arnhem Land, which is very far north of Australia. And his best thing was he was sent for 3 years to live with the Indians and to chat with them about their concepts of money. What do you think of money? And I had the best time. I spent nearly 5 hours with them, 3 of them in the pub, but we only had 2 drinks. It was the first time in Ireland. And the stories you got were just amazing. I mean, have you ever thought, what do you do when you go and see a native tribe? How do you walk up high? I'd like to live with you for 3 years. Do you mind? Try and do that in this country. But they accepted him. He wound up representing them. And possibly the best story I saw was that I said to him, well, what do they value? He said, they value knowledge and stories. That's what they actually value. They don't value money. But they're accountable to each other for their knowledge and stories. So if you're the person who knows the best place to find birds, then that's your job, or how to kill crocodiles. In fact, crocodile hunting was another good story. He said, and we would go crocodile hunting with the dogs. I said, what? You take the dogs crocodile hunting? He says, yeah, of course. Once one of the dogs is missing, we know the crocodiles are near. But he told a lovely story about, he wound up with 6 wives, another bit, but they were all over 60, and he's a young, virile-looking, sort of 30-year-old Italian. And anyway, he has these 6 wives and hundreds of children. And he told 2 stories I'll just share with you about money and all that. In their culture, I can demand everything. And this comes to your points about accountability and confidence, believe it or not. But there are rings of things. So, for example, I like your watch back there. Can I have the watch? Well, you almost have to give it to me. Oh, gosh, yes. Anyway, I keep doing this for a while. And you get pretty angry with me. And you turn to your wife and you say, well, go ask Michael's wife, Elizabeth, about her earrings. So your wife comes up and says, oh, hey, Elizabeth, those are really nice earrings. I'll have a few of those. Well, of course, what happens that night is Elizabeth starts thumping me. If you weren't so greedy about your watches, I still have those pretty earrings. And they have all these concentric circles of communities that are actually balancing out their society. The second thing he told was that, in doing this, you find interesting situations. For example, one of the tribes people went round to everybody and said, you've got all this money from selling art, which isn't art to them, it's maps, but you get all this money, could I have some of it? And I said, yeah, that's fine. And he says, I have this vision of freedom. I could be free if I had a car. So he gets $60,000 together, goes to the village, buys a car, and comes back. 3 days later, Giovanni's walking by. The car has been torched. So you just torched a brand new car. Guys, yeah, didn't get me freedom. The problem was, everybody came up, they don't walk 15 miles to the fishing grounds for fun. Everybody kept asking me for lifts. And I got really sick of this, so I torched the car. And so I said to Giovanni, I said, well, they value stories and knowledge. What was your first story? He said, well, my first story was that I didn't know what to say to them about my life. They live very simply. So I told them about my mother in Sardinia and her fight with the local business and how this resulted in me having to negotiate. Well, anyway, 8 months later, a mining company comes, talks to them. They say, well, this is one of our tribe's people, a little pale by our standards, but he would like to represent us. And so Giovanni does what he did in Sardinia. He has these big sessions where he gets together and chats. And one of his sisters gets up, and she has her little magic pouch, which is basically her token set of what they consider to be money, what she knows. And she comes up with an Australian dollar, and I don't know if any of you know Australian money, but A, it's plastic, and B, it has these sort of see-through things, one of the great things about Australian money. And she comes up and she goes, look at this. This is not money. You can see through it. There is no magic inside. This is my pouch with all my knowledge. You cannot see through it. There is magic inside, and these whole things. So what am I getting to? Well, I think the thing that drives me is, if I address the first question there, which is about the long term, we don't put enough trust. I would actually argue that people talk about transparency as if it's a good or a value, and I disagree. I think transparency is a tool. And there are many occasions when, over-eager transparency rules have prevented management's ability to manage. I'll give you a good example was, these days, what's the big rage? Pension funds, We raided the pension funds. Well, I was around as an auditor at the time when the government was trying to claw tax revenue out of pension funds. Pension funds were a great way for management to store in the good times and not pay as much in the bad and smooth earnings. And they know that investors like nice, smooth earnings. So that pays off, typically about a 30-35% margin given to the top quintile for that smoothing. So here was a tool. The accountants removed it, and I'm guilty of that myself, and the auditors by saying, no, you have to be absolutely accurate about it. And the government said, this is great because we get more tax revenue. So all these companies gave a pension holiday. In fact, they were forced to give a pension holiday, and another lever was removed of management being able to control things. So I think as transparency can be a bad thing as well as a good thing. So you have to think about why you're using that tool. And on the long term, I would argue we have, in many areas, too much transparency. Quarterly assessment of investment managers, monthly assessment, quarterly results earnings, AIM announcements, etc. Turning to confidence in public institutions, I don't think you can have confidence if, arguably, you have too much transparency. I don't need to trust you. Trust is about an enduring thing over time. So if I say to you, how are you doing? And you say, well, you can read it on the website. I don't need to ask you how you're doing, and I don't actually have to have trust in you. The numbers here are terrible, aren't they? These are ghastly. But if you say to me, well, Michael, I'm in charge of this. This is my job. I know my responsibilities. I tell you I'm doing well. I'm having a few problems. Then I have to trust you, don't I? And I have to keep the confidence level up. And I sometimes feel that too frequent reporting is doing it. And I think that leads to the last thing, which is accountability. I can really only be accountable to the community I'm in. And I think in many cases, particularly in Britain, to a lesser degree in Germany, to a high degree in France, the centralization leads to too much accountability by too few people. There's no such thing as a national community, in my opinion. So those would be my thoughts to your three very, very pertinent comments. We'll take a couple more comments, then I think we'll have to break. But James, can we do one or two more?
Hi, I'm Mustafa. In telecoms industry. You spoke a lot about morality and values in turbulent times. I don't think anybody out there would disagree with many of the things that has been spoken about. When you talk about honesty, when you talk about transparency, and you talk about kindness and love, everybody likes those things. Everybody looks up at these values. However, why is it that people do not wholesale adopt these values easily? Corporations, governments, they aren't entities on their own. They're made up of people like you and I. And if individuals adopted values, if they really think these are values worth adopting, and they adopted them, then our governments and our corporations wouldn't need to hide behind CSR in their PR department or government media spin gurus creating all sorts of stories to keep politicians' private lives away from the public lives, etc. The question is really, why don't people, individuals, adopt moral values outright?
Okay. And a final comment or question? Well, I think, gentleman over here, and then I'll close.
Hi. My name is Doug Parkin. You talk very eloquently about, if you like, bringing the staff on board with values and that within a company. To what extent do you think that we have a responsibility as consumers to look at companies and say, I'm not prepared to do business with that company because I don't believe it has values, and if it does, those are not my values, and I don't think they're the values of our society. Because I must admit, I'm now retired, but for 40 years in business, I don't think I can honestly say I was ever felt that went on too much. You look at companies and think, don't think so, sunshine. You know, I wouldn't say it was about values. It was about, I don't think you're going to be there next week, sort of attitude.
Well, I don't think that Ken exactly had the answer to world peace and honesty and love. And if he does, I wish he'd share it more rapidly. So that would be good. But I do think you raise a very important point. And I think Ken has done us a good job this evening of bringing us back to, ultimately, it's within each of us. And then I think within our communities. And then we move on to our economies and our organizations and our politicians and the wider world. I must say, in terms of kind of values, it's always hard to measure values. I mean, the best con artist in the world is always looking great up until the minute he runs away with your money, or she. So we have that. I must say that I've given a lot of thought to the communication of values. I gave one of my lectures here was, you know, take my profitability, please, and it was about measuring CSR a few years ago. So I'm interested. I also think that there have been some sort of new techniques in a way. I would point you to the ethical certification bodies such as the Marine Stewardship Council or the Forestry Stewardship Council, which are in some ways trying to say that these organizations that they're auditing hold to a set of values that are conducive to what you as a consumer are trying to achieve. I think as well, there's probably two last points about that interesting link between us as consumers and ethics and values, and that's that I feel that the world is going to be a better place if and only if people make better choices each and every day. And so you're right, it does behoove us to make those better choices that are in line with the values we want to see promulgated. I think that the market has always been predicated on the concept that it's our values that are being satisfied and that firms rise and fall on them. So in theory, and this goes back to your point, if we in ourselves can adopt these, if we can share them with our community, if those values then turn up in the marketplace, then all the theory, all the economic theory, all the behavioral theory, all the anthropological theory says those are the sorts of firms that will endure and be, as Ken points out in here, the ultimate performers. So I guess I can only say in conclusion, thank you for your time tonight. I think Ken's done us a great job in inspiring us to think, and you're all correct that if we go away with better values in our own hearts, then that's probably what will make the biggest difference to the world. So thank you very much.